Well, our next guest believes that maybe we ought to have some more conversations about this and have a little more hope and push the conversation a little harder. Dr. Saul Cornell is the Paul and Diane Gunter Chair in American History at Fordham University. The Twitter handle is at Fordham University. Dr. Cornell, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I don't mean to oversimplify, but it does seem like the president was saying there, well, the best I can do is really talk about gun control. There's nothing I can do at this point. And barring any sort of executive action, it does seem that Congress is loath to take this issue up. Your contention is that the arguments today are probably not being framed the way they should be, I think, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly.
Yes, that's a pretty good summary, but I would say the historical arguments that invoke the Second Amendment are very poorly framed. I think, in fact, the more you hear people tout the Second Amendment, it's usually a sign that they haven't really thought about it and tried to understand it in a very deep way, because the Second Amendment doesn't really present any serious barrier to common sense gun regulation. The Second Amendment sort of presupposes the idea of regulation. You wouldn't have been able to fight against Britain with a militia unless you had a sort of regulatory regime in place that made it possible to have a well-regulated militia. And then secondly, if you think about the contemporary policy issues, on one side you hear, guns don't cause crime, guns don't kill people. But those same people seem to think that guns cause freedom, that guns are all that make us American. In fact, guns are just tools, they're instrumentalities. They neither cause freedom, they neither cause crime. But what they do is they make certain kinds of impulsive behaviors extremely dangerous. And that's kind of the new paradigm in sort of public health. Thinking about, if we just think about guns as a public health problem, how can we make Americans safer? And there clearly are some things that can be done. We know that if you have a gun in a house and there's a domestic abuser, the chances of that gun being used against an abused spouse or girlfriend increases dramatically. So those kind of common sense things should be the kind of debate we're having. But instead, it always goes back to this very tiresome, ideological, very shrill debate about the Second Amendment. And it's not even the real Second Amendment we're talking about. It's kind of a Red Dawn fantasy of modern American culture.
Sort of like what we think the Second Amendment might be about. I asked this, and this is kind of an odd way of bringing it about, but I think of things like, movies where people watch The Unforgiven, where the sheriff says when you come into town you have to leave your guns at the gate, or Rio Bravo, it's a John Wayne movie, the same thing. You got to leave your guns at the gate. In other words, and I don't know if there was ever a Second Amendment case about that, but your point in the piece you wrote for CNN, our ideas of armed self-defense were at odds with the founders' vision. Sort of put it all together for us. What was the sense, do you think, the founders had of what we should be able to do and not able to do, and how gun laws would not run afoul at all of their vision?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that, for instance, the sort of stand your ground laws that have popped up in so many places, the dominant understanding at the time of the Second Amendment was you had a duty to retreat. The only place you could stand your ground was in your house, and so there was always a recognition that armed self-defense in the house was a special case. Once you entered the public, where there was much greater potential for collateral harm, your right to use firearms in self-defense narrowed. And basically, the idea was if there was a clear threat, or you were in a place where there was really no reasonable opportunity or expectation that you could seek help, then you were entitled to arm yourself. But the idea that there was this broad, permissive right to carry firearms and that, there was a little bubble around you that was your castle and you took your castle wherever you went, that's a modern invention. In the founding era, at the time of the Second Amendment, there was a very strict differentiation between the scope of the right inside the house and the much more narrow scope of the right outside of the house. I mean, the big thing to keep in mind is the Founding Fathers were not radical libertarians. They viewed anarchy as a danger to be avoided just as much as they viewed tyranny. So, they were fearful of a strong government, but they were also fearful of a situation in which individuals did not come together, pass good laws, and obey those laws. They were Whigs. They were not libertarians or radical, statists, if you will.
Well, if for example, Thomas Jefferson, people would often grab a quote from him and say, well, a little revolution from time to time is not a bad thing. So was that just sort of an outlier quote for him, or is that the idea that he was maybe one of those who thought a little differently about anarchy?
Well, here's the thing about Jefferson. When Jefferson says that, he's, of course, drinking Chateau Lafite in Paris, where he's having his slave pastry chef, Madison Hemmings, bake the latest French creations. And that's in regard to Shays' Rebellion. Of course, when it's African slaves in Virginia who are grabbing guns and asserting a right of revolution, Jefferson is very quick to put down that rebellion and have those slaves executed.
So he was a contextualist.
Yes, I mean, Jefferson is endlessly fascinating, but he's also, because he's so endlessly fascinating, he's probably one of the least typical members of the founding generation.
Yeah, I guess
part of Monticello.
Sure,
see that.
And it is a beautiful place, like you say. I guess the question is the founding fathers. It seems to me is one of the toughest phrases to really use as a qualifier for a lot of justification because they were different men. There was a sense as gathered together in the Bill of Rights, but to say that any one of them was for or against something, it's hard to generalize, I think, sometimes with the founding fathers.
Well, I'm so glad you said that because that whole phrase, the founders said, is one of the most frustrating to a historian because you're right. Within seconds of the Constitution being adopted and the Bill of Rights being framed, they were arguing with one another almost as intensely as we do today. I mean, Hamilton and Madison had worked together to get the Constitution ratified and wrote the Federalist, and they were on the opposite side of every major issue in the 1790s.
And speaking of, and make the comparison in other Bills of Rights, Bill of Rights amendments, for example, let's take freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is not totally unfettered. There are regulations in this country. There are obviously different consequences for the abrogation of that right, depending on which particular speech you're trying to put out there and promulgate. But I wonder if we look at this and say, there's a difference between the efficacy of legislation that stops speech and the efficacy of legislation that changes how we can or cannot own guns. And I wonder if you can get to that and the efficacy of gun legislation, because one of the other parts of this discussion is about not just the amendment itself, but rather whether or not anything will be effective in the stopping of the gun violence.
Sure. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that guns and words are not fungible. No one was ever killed by a drive-by printing, for instance. So the comparison is faulty, and the founders actually...
Well, Hannibal Lecter killed a guy in prison in Silence of the Lambs by just talking to him, so... I'm just kidding.
Well, I should say there are some people who, if you spoke to them long enough, you would want to kill yourself. But that's
nicely qualified, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a sort of different thing. But look, it's very clear that the founders thought that above all, you couldn't put a prior restraint. That if you actually published something, you had to be held responsible, and people were published for libel and things like that. But the founders were not neutral about guns. For one thing, they told most Americans what kind of guns they needed to buy to participate in the militia, and you were not compensated. So in a way, what people often forget is the Second Amendment is actually part of a taxation scheme. It's the first unfunded federal mandate where you're transferring the cost of public defense to individual households. So we have a tough time thinking that you can have a right and that could be tied to an obligation. But in the 18th century, that notion was not at all unusual. The idea that rights carried obligations, not just for others that they had to respect your rights, but that you, to exercise that right, were actually meeting a deeper obligation. That was a holdover from an older natural law view of rights, which the founders were heirs to. Now, as far as the efficacy of gun regulation today, as I said, there's been a big change, even though that funding for gun research has been starved by the federal government. People have done a lot of interesting things, and what we know now is very important. We know that the primary focus of gun violence reduction should be on getting guns out of the hands of people who have impulse control issues. So, people have alcohol problems, people have histories of violence, things like that. And we know that, people always, whenever I give a talk, say, criminals won't obey laws. We don't need another law. But there is one law we know that criminals do obey, and that's the law of supply and demand. And we know that criminals are not the only group in America who oppose capitalism. In fact, they would hardly be criminals stealing material possessions if they were not into the capitalist system. They're just into a kind of shadow part of the capitalist system. And we know from actual research done with gangs in Chicago that, Chicago has very tough gun laws, but everywhere around Chicago the gun laws are pretty weak. So to expect Chicago to be able to implement gun control is not realistic given what's going on around it. But even with that very loophole-filled and poor system, Chicago is not the deadliest city in America. Many cities in places where there are permissive gun laws actually have higher body counts per 100,000. And the price of guns and bullets in the inner city of Chicago is extremely high. And so we are seeing some market forces at work there. And if we drive up the cost of guns in that illegal market, we won't get rid of gun violence, but we'll have a meaningful effect. And I think that's the kind of rational discussion we should be having.
I appreciate you joining the conversation, and I'm sure it's not over yet, obviously. But
I suppose not.
Dr. Saul Cornell, thank you for joining us on POTUS today.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Saul Cornell, Paul and Diane Gunther, Chair in American History at Fordham University, joining us. His topic, the Second Amendment, some things he's been writing about on CNN. Thought you'd like to hear the conversation. The Twitter handle is @FordhamHistory.